Most of the biggest cities that we have in the colonies were on the coast, next to the water. Why? Ports, trading. Okay. Even today, most of our biggest cities are. It will, until we get it to where we can make electric power plants, we do not have very many places that aren't on the water. And even today, you look at most of our older cities, our bigger cities that are someplace else that are not near the water are very new. Places like Denver, Colorado. They are newer cities. Even someplace like Orlando, which is not, I mean, even though that's not too far away. Depending on what time period we're looking at here for the colonies, our three biggest cities are Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. Early on, it was Boston as the largest. Then later on, Philadelphia will take over. And then basically around the time we become a country, and early on in our country, New York. But those are the three biggest. The biggest in the South is Charlestown. And no, I didn't misspell it. Originally, it was Charlestown, South Carolina. We now have it as Charleston. It was named after King Charles. And then we have Baltimore, would be the fifth largest. So that's where those are the major cities. All of them, they are ports. You have trading. You have all these groups coming in and out. Now, for the trading that they have, today you have to think of like warehouses. Because when these ships would come in, there might be a ship that only has 2 or 3 different products on that ship. So they send it to what would today would be like a warehouse that would then disperse it to other smaller stores there. These were our primary ports for those in what are called the primary port towns with it. We will then have secondary port towns. These are the cities that aren't as big, but we have a lot of trading going on with this. Now here's the key part that you have to look at and what the difference was. The royal government, the crown, will put a lot of their workers in New York, Philadelphia, Boston, regulate trade, try to get taxes, where in our next section of notes we will go into Mercantilism and Navigation Act. But in those smaller towns along the coast, they don't. Which means if you are a smuggler, and we had a lot of smuggling going on to avoid paying taxes, you don't go as much to New York City. You'll go to places like Hartford, Connecticut, and you kind of go to these smaller ports along the area. So you might stop in along the way and get some things from New York City or Boston or Philadelphia. But you have this whole trading network. And plus, if you're trading something within the colony, you kind of avoid those bigger places, and you avoid where the government will know that you exist. It's kind of like even today. Sometimes you'll have some businesses, and they'll try to, instead of being in the middle of Tampa, they'll locate in a smaller area where if they're maybe doing something that either they're not quite following the rules like you should, or they may be doing something illegal, are they more likely to get caught if they're in Tampa or they're doing it somewhere in Levy County? So, right, you're going to get caught in Tampa because people are going to see it. Meanwhile, you can get away from stuff. And so this is where that same idea is going on. Now, there is the smuggling, but also what happens in it when somebody would get busted for smuggling, we will have this backlash and this American idea that we have that it's almost our right that we should be able to do this. And a lot of the political activism builds up in these smaller areas, which will play later on. We're going to have later on an SFI called Committees of Correspondence, which in these towns they're going to not only be trading back and forth with each other, they're going to be corresponding, communicating with each other. And that will be parts that will lead us to breaking away from Britain here. So you kind of look at this again, you don't really, I mean, it's the broad idea, but this is where do we get this discontent that we have and there. A lot of people that lived in New York, Philadelphia, they worked for the king. So if they were to break away, they'd lose their job. But if you were in a small port away from it, you wouldn't. The other group of city are the fall line cities. You want to know why it's called the fall line?
Does the ships could only go that far?
Because if they went any further upriver, what would they hit?
Land?
They will fall at the end of the earth.
No, they would hit a waterfall. Is that very good for ships or boats? It's fun if you're in a kayak, not fun if you have your
Not
livelihood in a
always.
boat. So what happened, this is where these cities that you go and you look at, I mean, you may not, they're not big cities for all of them, some of them are. Macon, Augusta, Columbia, Raleigh, Petersburg, Virginia, Richmond, Washington DC, Baltimore, Wilmington, Trenton, Philadelphia. You have this where that's as far as a boat can come. And if you were living on the frontier, that was the closest place that you could come that you would then be able to put your products on a ship. And a lot of these cities would establish there. And that gave a connection to the frontier with the coastal areas that most people lived. All right, now we're going to get up, and here's where the geography comes from. Our New England colonies, the 4 New England colonies are Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. Now for the broadside for each of these in here, and this is where you're going to have, in your first real essay will basically be, compare the New England colonies with the Chesapeake, Southern colonies. Basically, you're going to compare using not just this section, but other parts that you have. Religion, economics, different attitudes that they have in here. So you do know, if you don't know which are which colonies, you've already gone and made yourself where you're not going to be able to write about it here. But they had a diversified economy. What does that mean?
Very diverse.
What does that mean?
There was everything.
Yeah, varying. They have a lot of different ways, and economy is how they make money. Usually still, 3/4 or more of the people were farmers, and at that time you had to be. But there's a lot of others. Shipbuilding. A lot of the British ships were built in New England. One of the reasons why is they ran out of trees in England. They had cut down the forest. Meanwhile, we have all these forests. And there will be times, they go through and pick out trees, and they had a symbol that they would basically stamp on this tree that said, this tree belongs to the king. Here in Florida, when the Spanish owned us, they went, and it was not in this area, but on the East Coast and in the central area where they have these huge oak trees. They went and said for oak trees that you cannot do something to this oak tree, it belonged to the King of Spain. Now, does anybody know for live oak trees, not laurel oaks, for those of you that measure, what is so great about these giant live oak trees that the king would want to make sure they're not torn out or cut down?
You can use them for ships.
But where in a ship?
The mast, the giant where it holds up the biggest sail.
No, and that's what the British did for the real tall ships in there. But for those live oaks aren't big straight trees.
The whole.
Yeah, the whole. Because live oaks don't grow straight. They have big curvy branches. So they would go and look for these trees that had what would be the natural curve that you would want for the front of a ship. And if you saw some of those 200-300-year-old live oak trees, I mean, those are ones you like to climb on. Well, so did Forrest Gump. But this is where those giant branches that you have. Well, if it has a curve on it, that would be what you'd want for the front of the ship. Then that's what they would use for building the ship instead of trying to splice together and build the curve of a lot of different pieces of wood together. And oak is very strong wood, so that's why here in Florida, live oak trees were extremely valuable. But in New England, they're building a lot of the ships, which helps the timber industry. Because of the ships being built there, they also naturally did the trading. Most of our trading, even trading that was done a lot of times in the South, the ships were coming from New England. There was the fishing industry. Those of you that know in the Grand Banks area off of Newfoundland is some of the richest fishing grounds in the world. So their ships would sell there. All of the colonies had slavery at one time or another, but in these New England colonies it would die out. Why?
Wasn't it dying out in England?
What?
Wasn't it dying out in England at that
It was
time?
dying out in England too, but what about New England? Why?
They didn't need them.
Why did they not eat them?
There was a higher concentration of people in New England than there was. Like, they were more spread out in the frontier, but they couldn't find work as easily.
Somewhat. It does have to do somewhat with finding work. There's something else though. No, it's not with indentured servants because that would also die out a lot up north.
Slaves are expensive, aren't they?
Yeah, they are.
Did they have like enough skilled people to do it?
It's not because they had more skilled workers. Again, 3/4 or more of the people are farmers. But what crops are growing in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island?
Like,
Yeah, ones you really don't need slaves. They're not labor intensive. You're gonna have something that you have a couple of weeks in the spring, you got a whole lot of work to do, and a couple of weeks in the fall, a whole lot of work to do. And the rest of the year, do you need a lot of work or labor?
No.
No. So, but if you have a slave, can you put them away for 3 months? Or do you still have to, and this is where not only expensive to buy, but to keep them. So for them, and this is where Maria, you said about they had more people, well they had more, if they needed to hire someone for like a part-time labor for a couple weeks, they had that. And it was. Now the biggest thing of all is, and this is where you're gonna find for slavery, and people sometimes think, oh, well, you know, the northern states were more moral. It wasn't that. It comes down to economics. It didn't make economic sense to have slaves. You could make more money without slaves than to have slaves in the northern, so that's why it will die out. All right, a lot of the base of what we have in America for our democratic ideas comes from some of these New England areas. Even today, when you go to little New England towns, they have town meetings every year that they get together and make the laws, and everybody votes for that. Again, we have a representative government, but we have those ideas. Put stars or arrows so you don't miss this when you are studying your notes later on, because this is one thing that a lot of times I don't spend a long time on, but it actually is something that reoccurs in here. The Dominion of New England. When England was fighting in the Civil War, was the Glorious Revolution, these colonies came together and they joined together in what is called the Dominion of New England. When the Civil War was over, England came back, and the crown, the royal government said, no, 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 you all are not to be as one, and broke up the Dominion of New England. Why would they break them up?
They're getting too strong.
Getting too strong?
Yeah, they're less powerful when they're all separated and divided. It's kind of like divide and conquer. They take each little part and they control each part of it.
And that's exactly it. This is where, I mean, early on, the British realized we do not want these colonies to get together. It's easier to control the smaller individual ones than one bigger one there. And so it does come down to control that we would have. All right, now for each of these colonies. The first colony is Plymouth, which I don't spend much time on because it quickly dies out and merges with Massachusetts. If you want to know more details of it, you can research on your own, but for the long term, it's not really that important with the Pilgrims in there. Massachusetts we went over in the last couple of days. The Puritans found it. It will be the biggest. It will be the most powerful. Britain actually is getting worried that it is becoming too powerful. And you will see that we will have, well, they start splitting off some of it on purpose, but then we have groups that break off. Rhode Island we had before, Roger Williams. He breaks away because he doesn't agree with the idea of that theocracy. He breaks away and makes his colony in Rhode Island. He lives up to it and sets it up where there is a separation of church and state. The other thing that he does, which is not very common, but in this case it is common, this is one thing that he does. He works with the Indians, he pays for the land, and they coexist on Rhode Island. Rhode Island is one of two places that we can look at where there is this good relationship between the British and the Indians when they settled there. Connecticut. Some of the people break away from Massachusetts. They are led by the Reverend Thomas Hooker. And it starts, the name of it originally is Hartford Colony. It will later on be changed to Connecticut. The thing about Connecticut that's lasting is they will establish a government that is not a theocracy, but is a representative government, like what we have in the United States. The fundamental orders of Connecticut will make it where you elect people to make the laws. New Hampshire, for those of you that have any relatives for New Hampshire, not a whole lot there. Basically, this is where the king is trying to weaken Massachusetts, so they split it off and makes it their own. Why do I not have Vermont and Maine as those colonies, even though they're in New England?
Did they come about at this time? Were they there?
They're,
They're
well,
the Dutch,
as places.
weren't they? I
What?
think the Dutch and the French.
No, it's not the Dutch and the French.
Maine was a part of Massachusetts.
All right, Maine was a part of Massachusetts. Even though it's physically separated, it is technically part of it. Very few people lived in Maine. So it isn't hard. Later on, Maine will become its own state. And even today, not most people that live in Maine live right on the coast. I have a friend of mine who's from Maine, and we were kind of joking around the other day about how there was, like, the last couple of years, there hasn't been a single Division I signee for football from the entire state of Maine. And part of the reason being that while we have, like, Miami Central High, they'll have 15 people from that one high school sign it there. But one part of the reason being is so many of the schools in Maine and the rural area of Maine, they don't have enough people in the high school to have a football team. Because it's a bunch of small high schools that have 200 or 300 people total in the high school in that area. So it's not. Plus, it's not a big sport up there. Meanwhile, Vermont, the reason where Vermont comes in its history is New Hampshire claims it, and New York claims it, and they'll be fighting over that Green Mountain area. When we do become a country, we actually resolve the conflict by, okay, since you both claim it, we're going to make it its own state. And that's how Vermont became a state, is because those two areas claimed that area that you had. But both of them didn't have very many people.
What two areas did you say claimed Vermont?
New York and New Hampshire. They were both on each side of it. All right, our middle colonies. Guess where they are?
In the middle.
Yeah, they're in the middle, which actually, if we look at it, it's actually just north of the middle. New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Now, Pennsylvania and Delaware can sometimes be put in where I will talk about the Chesapeake colonies. Sometimes they are part of that, but I'm kind of putting all these together. Now, this area is known to be a lot more cosmopolitan. What does it mean by cosmopolitan? It's not always rich.
They're just kind of like cities.
Well, a city, usually somewhat with population. Some areas were very populated. Well, less rural, but the reason why you have that is you have a whole mixture of all kinds of different cultures coming in, which normally is in a city. And this is the area that we have. I mean, we even look back on it, and this is where our Dutch, or Swedish, or Finnish were. We're going to see the English, and some of the Irish will end up coming to this area. So we have a large mixture of people that come in. When we say that that America's a melting pot, well, that area was definitely a area that a lot of the stuff is being stirred into. It also had a diverse economy, just like we saw in New England. The agriculture is also a lot more diverse. And I know some of you think, when you think of New York, you think of it as a city. But those of you that may have family from New York, if they're from the city, they usually don't like to consider the rest of New York. They always forget about the rest of New York. If they are not from the city, they call themselves upstate New York, and they usually claim we have nothing to do with those people in the city. And this is where, for upstate New York, there is a lot of very good agriculture. I know here in Florida, we don't think of New York and agriculture. Pennsylvania is the same way. But the crops that they're growing there are grains, wheat, corn, oats, barley. They also had a lot of the agricultural products with dairy that you think of there. And that's where their diversity comes in. But it is not labor intensive. And just like New England, slavery will die out because they don't have the tobacco, indigo, rice that needs constant labor there. This is also the area that we have representative government, especially in Pennsylvania, that emerges from here. All right, now for each colony, New York. I know I've told you with the story, but here we have it actually in the news, or in the notes here, where James, the Duke of York, takes over after the Dutch originally settled it. New York becomes the name, no longer New Amsterdam. Port Orange becomes Albany. New Amsterdam becomes New York City. In the beginning, James tries to make it where he rules over it without any representative democracy, but the people there revolt against that. And we will have this saying that becomes very popular later on in the backcountry area: no taxation without representation. You can't make rules over us unless we have a say-so, and you can't tax us. And so they will make an assembly. Now, the assembly in New York will go in and out over time. We will be watching soon, 1776. And you're going to see in there, one of the representatives from New York keeps abstaining from votes, and then he will explain some about what was happening with their assembly, which is based some on history, where the New York Assembly was a lot of times disorganized there. Now for New Jersey, remember this is where the Swedish, the Finnish came. They give us the log cabin. They're quickly taken over by the Dutch, and not too long after that, the English take over them. And that's the history of New Jersey. Meanwhile, we have William Penn founding a colony. Any guess of what colony William Penn founds?
Pennsylvania.
California.
Now, if you look at the picture of William Penn, what does he remind you
The
of?
Quaker Oats guy.
Yeah, the Quaker Oats guy, and there for the oat mill, which he is a Quaker. It is a religious group. They are known, their official name is the Society of Friends. It is a Christian religion. It is very peaceful. They are pacifist. What does it mean if you're a pacifist?
You don't like
Against
violence.
war.
Yeah, they're against war, violence. Well, William Penn is also the son of a very rich man. His father had, and I don't know the amount in that money and what it would convert to today, but he had loaned the king, and let's say that it would be like hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money. Let's just round it off at $1 billion. Okay, give or take 50 cents. But this is where the king owes his father a lot of money. His father dies. If you owe somebody a lot of money and they die, does that debt go away?
No.
No, it goes to their estate. So the king now owns William Penn this money. William Penn goes to the king and says, I know you owe a lot of money from my father. And he negotiates a deal that the king will erase, that William Penn will erase that debt if the king gives him land in the New World. For the king, this is a great deal. I mean, I don't have to pay you back all this money, and I give you land that somebody went over and put a flag and claimed in my great-grandfather's name. Then I'm never going there myself. Here, let's sign the paper. Don't change your mind. Okay? So, William Penn buys this land for his church and his people, and that is where Pennsylvania is founded. That's where the house acquired in there. A vocabulary word you need to know in this: proprietary colony. Remember, we had royal colonies, which the king controlled. Well, proprietary colony is one that the king gives the land to an individual. In this case, William Penn. So he sets up Pennsylvania. When they get there, there's a problem. There's already people on the land that William Penn has bought. Who was there?
Indian.
Yeah, those pesky Indians still thinking that just because they've lived there for 10,000 years, that for some reason or another it belongs to them.
No.
I know. And how do the Quakers take care of that problem?
Well, they're pacifists.
Yeah, they're pacifists, so they're
They
not going to be
become
like the
brand
other
new.
English.
Rat killer. They killed them nicely.
They bribe them off.
No. William Penn actually works out a deal. He spends pretty much his fortune buying the land a second time from the Indians.
This is what I thought.
And they work out a peaceful deal and actually coexist pretty peacefully with the Indians and the Native Americans there. Now, William Penn will die losing his fortune. But is he immortal?
Well, he has a state named after him. So.
Yeah, we're talking about him a couple hundred years later. So, yeah, and also, yeah, he's there for the old mill. But that is where Pennsylvania and how it's acquired, is by one man for his church that he has. Now, Pennsylvania becomes known as the Holy Experiment. It is extremely cosmopolitan. All kinds of different groups move there. One thing about Pennsylvania, even though the Quakers are there, they pass what is the Charter of Liberty, saying that you can be any religion and you are basically given equal rights in Pennsylvania. So the Quakers allow other groups, even those different, to have a say-so. To tell you how much of an experiment this is and where the Quakers were different, they also allowed women to have many of the high positions in the church. And in some instances, even having, not total, but having some political power. That is an experiment, isn't it?
You don't know.
Here's where we look at it and you kind of say, and I have the question here, how is this different from Massachusetts? We have a colony, which it is a religious group that starts it. Now, if you're a Puritan and you move from Boston to Philadelphia, are you still allowed to worship the way you want?
Yes.
Yeah, Charter of Liberty said that. And you're going to be given as you are an equal citizen in the state of Pennsylvania. If you are a Quaker and you move from Philadelphia to Boston, what happens to you there?
You're gonna get probably persecuted.
Yeah, you are persecuted, you are not given any rights. How did the Puritans treat the Indians?
Like garbage.
Yeah, basically, they were trying to drive them off. How did the Quakers treat the Indians?
Pretty good. They gave them a bunch of money and said they could live there.
They're both Christian groups. Which one was more Christian?
Hmm.
Okay, and you kind of look in here, and this is where we kind of look back and see. Meanwhile, for those of you with any relatives from Delaware, sorry they don't have much for Delaware. There isn't much about Delaware. Three of the counties broke off and made the state of Delaware, and that's Delaware's start. All right, the Chesapeake colonies. Maryland, Virginia, and this is where, when you look at the Chesapeake, even though I put them with the middle colonies, Pennsylvania and Delaware touch the Chesapeake also. So this is where they can go. This is the center of the British colonies. They each go in different ways. They are not all the same. Again, Pennsylvania and Delaware by the Quakers. Who started Maryland?
Lord Baltimore.
Lord Baltimore and the Catholics. Meanwhile, Virginia was the Virginia Company in there. This word tidewater, that is the area, and I have this aerial map, where the Chesapeake Bay, all these rivers and creeks that flow up in there, that is the tidewater. Rich land. And this is where a lot of those plantations, starting with Jamestown, but other plantations that will then go and come about. Maryland, we had this before with it, but Lord Baltimore, George Calvert being his real name, and there as a haven for Catholics. It is also a territory colony. They will pass the Act of Toleration. So that's the SFI to remember with them. Allows for freedom of religion as long as you are Christian. And they're Catholic, but they're allowing Protestants also. And this will go back and forth. It actually at times was suspended, but for the most part, that is the idea, and then the long-lasting idea for America is the freedom of religion. Meanwhile, for Virginia, the Virginia Company failed, that's where the king gave it to it. The king takes back the area. It becomes a royal colony. That is why in Bacon's Rebellion, he has a royal governor that is in charge of it. In Berkeley, the problem you're going to find in Virginia, it is the biggest, it is the richest, but you have a big divide between the rich and the poor. You are going to have these extremely wealthy planters living there with their huge plantations. Again, some, because of the headright system, and because of slavery and indentured servants, they may have 30, 40,000 acre farms. Meanwhile, you have other people that are extremely poor, and you're going to have this real divide between the rich and the poor that is going on in Virginia. But Virginia is the largest in size. It is the most powerful politically. It is the richest. And we're going to find when we break away, and even early on in our country, 4 of our first 5 presidents are from the state of Virginia. And that is where their power will be. All right, I'm going to stop on that point.
Do you have something else to show?
Yes. Well, I meant to show you the other day. Most of you know with the South. Now, we technically, sometimes they will split up the colonies, with Virginia being part of the South. Maryland sometimes will be part of the South. I put them with the Chesapeake because they are a little bit different than these others in here. But Georgia and the Carolinas are one of the true southern colonies that we have. These colonies were based on agriculture. And for making money, they were plantation economies. That we have, and we will have those plantations. And that's why for Maryland and Virginia, you have that also. The difference is Virginia will be different government-wise. Maryland, because of the founding for religion, that's why I kind of separate them a little bit. The other thing that you have is the products that these deeper south were doing. There was not as much tobacco, where people think cotton, not yet. There was a little bit, and the type of cotton that was actually grown there was on the islands that did not have as much seed in it. But rice and indigo, and that's what they would be having on it there. Here's where I get to the deeper question, and this includes all of the areas in the South, again, Maryland, Virginia too. Why would indentured servitude die out? There's several different reasons why.
Bacon's Rebellion?
Bacon's Rebellion is one of them. The impact of that is one of those, because after Bacon's Rebellion and you had those indentured servants come back and kill some of the masters realized maybe that isn't as good of a system. But there's another bigger reason that comes down to it also that happened at the same time. And it comes down to supply and demand for economics. The number of indentured servants volunteering went down. Why would it go down?
They realized maybe that it wasn't as great as they thought it would be because they're not getting the things they were promised.
Yeah, now more and more of the stories are coming back to England and Europe that are showing that this may not be 7 years and good. All right, this is 7 years of really hard work, nasty work that you're going to have there. So there were not as many people willing to volunteer. Plus, by this time, the economy had gotten better in Europe, and so there were more jobs. There weren't as many people as desperate, plus it wasn't as much of a lure there. So if there are less people, the price then for an indentured servant will end up going up. So you'd have to pay higher price for indentured servants. And on the other side, this is where we will end up having, and we'll see in our next section, where our northern colonies will contribute to this as we get more and more ships from the New England colonies going to Africa. We're bringing back more slaves to the South. So the price of slaves went down. So ultimately it came to economics and supply and demand. There are less indentured servants and the price going up for them, more slaves, and the price going down. And you add to that the side with Bacon's Rebellion in there. All right. Now, word hierarchy, we had that in our very first section, but in the South, this is where it will end up being a hierarchy. And one thing you'll find when we start next quarter, when we're doing our reviews, one of our sections we will do is we will look at the South. And we will find that this hierarchy in the South that starts in the colonies, in some places we could actually probably go to some towns in the Deep South, and a lot of this hierarchy still kind of exists, that the ancestors of the planters are still ruling that area. But we will have this where the plantation owners, the planters, will be the ones ruling. Small farmers, there were some in there, and this would be our middle class, but that is a smaller group. Meanwhile, there are a lot of poor farmers. When we get to Reconstruction, whether they're white or black, we are going to have a lot of poor sharecroppers, people that are tenant farmers and poor farmers. And then the very bottom would be slaves. And that hierarchy will exist in the South there. This is one, I think you had this in your reading in here. But it says, how is a woman's power single compared to being married in the South? Does he want her? I told her it's an AP class, she'll come at the end. Emily, at the end, you'll see Mr. Ackley. But this is where for women, there is a little bit different. What happened when you got married in the South as a woman? Did you have much rights?
No.
What happened when your husband died?
You remarried.
Well, you could remarry.
You were a widow.
Did you get control of the estate as a widow?
I say no.
You would, but how long is it that you would have control of all of the finances and everything?
Till the sun runs off it?
Yeah, until basically the son, and almost like in Europe, the oldest son, but until the son became the age of a man. And then the son takes over the plantation. Now, he's going to be a good son and take care of his mom, I'm sure. What if he didn't have any sons, though? Now, do you control things? Yeah, they would pretty much control it. So this is where, for a single woman, could have a lot more power. In that case, that you'd have, and it is kind of also, even if we go onto the poorer side of this, if you are a daughter of a farmer, if you're staying single, one thing about these southern colonies, there were a lot more men than there were women. Now, women will never use their sexual appeal, will they, to try to get what they want. And this is where, for some of the women, they could use this as a single woman, because there was such a demand to try to find a wife. Even women that were indentured servants, they were highly sought after, and that you would try to go and lure them for marriage, because again, there was a lot less women than men. It's not like in New England, where in New England they came over as families. So this is where you will have a difference in it. This is one thing you look at. You kind of think of things. A lot of times you think that health is going to be better in an area that is warmer. But one of the problems that we will find in the South, though, is that in a lot of places they're going to have poor water. And this is where, for a lot of diseases, bacteria that you would have. One of the things that will end up helping in some areas, and this is where, if you actually study the Pilgrims, one of the main things the Mayflower had on it was beer. And the Pilgrims would have a lot of beer. Why did some of the groups, and this is where some of you know an area, what was good about beer?
The alcohol killed the bacteria.
Well, the alcohol, well, it actually wasn't so much the alcohol that killed it, but when the fermentation process, it would actually kill it when the heat would go up for it. And this is where some of you is also like ancient Egypt, and where they had kegs of beer on the Mayflower. Unless you have light beer, is it high in a lot of calories? So it was something actually used for nutrition, where if you're trying to store flour on a boat, will it maybe go bad? So that's why it was actually used a lot in that case. A lot of people were realizing with different alcohol and especially with beer that if they were drinking that, they weren't getting sick compared to people that were drinking water. Not realizing that it wasn't the beer, it was the fact that actually the process that you have that was killing off the bacteria. There. All right, the two ways to look at it. For the Carolinas, I keep it pretty simple. They will eventually split up. And there, remember where we had early on about in Europe with the younger brothers and some of them that would come over? Well, that's where the Carolinas, most of that was kind of split up and lands given to some of the royal families that you would have. South Carolina would have more of the richer families and more that were connected to the aristocracy. This North Carolina, if you ever been through North Carolina, South Carolina, North Carolina had a lot more small farms. And there, I don't have it in here, but we will have a lot of the Scotch Irish that will move into the mountains of North Carolina. Now, the people that were Scotch Irish background hated the English. And that's going to come back when we start studying the Revolutionary War about how they were fighting. So they split in 1729, but for the most part, most people at that time still were thinking of them. And the reason why they split is the people in North Carolina did not like that the South Carolina with their aristocratic background were so much over them. Georgia is founded by James Oglethorpe. We have Oglethorpe College in Georgia. 2 reasons why it's founded. What is south of Georgia? Florida. Who controlled Florida at this time in history?
Spain.
Yeah, Spain. South Carolina has the king's friends and some family members. Are they afraid that maybe Spain will come up and attack his friends and family? So, what's in between South Carolina and Florida?
Georgia.
Georgia. And so it was set up, first of all, as a military buffer. If you put some people in there, it'll give a warning for South Carolina. And the people that were sent there, and this is where when we did indentured servants, where I said a lot of them were small-time criminals and a lot of debtors, okay? Which you don't think of debtors as prisoners, but you were put in jail until you could pay it off. The jails were filling up in England, so that's what was made, and that's how Georgia would end up starting, is as a lot of them would come, work as indentured servants, work off their debt, work off what their small crime was, and then they were free to go. Most of them then stayed in Georgia, and that's, again, how Georgia was founded. And that's the end of our different colonies.